welcome to this tutorial. My name's Nikki, I am the founder of Studio HOIME. HOIME stands for Here's One I Made Earlier, and I specialise in supplying DIY craft kits for groups and individuals to try out a new skill or hobby without having to buy the materials in excess quantities. Today we're making a Christmas fresh foliage wreath, and there are a couple of options. You may well have bought one of my kits in various forms. In front of me here I've got the full kit, so I'm going to take you through all the ingredients that we have. You will know that there's two options. We've got traditional citrus option, which is your reds and your oranges, and then there's a cool neutral option, which is a bit more modern and it's based on green and white. I'm going to make a cool neutral one today, but all the way through I'll tell you what I'm substituting, which would be the traditional version. Now, the foliage that I have here today may be different from the one that you get in your kit. That's purely down to what is in good supply at the time. But basically, and if you're making it yourself with foliage from your garden, I've recommended that you use, as well as spruce, you use 3 forms of foliage and some berries. That's essentially it. But I'm going to take you through all of the various materials that I've got in the kit now. Okay, so you may have got some or all of the kit. In the full kit we've got a 12-inch copper wreath base, some real wire, some jute string, some stub wires, some Hessian ribbon. Then for the pre-wired dried sections we've got some dried limes, whereas in the traditional citrus you will have oranges. We have some pre-wired cones with sprayed a little bit white, whereas in the traditional citrus they are plain. Then we've got some pre-wired cinnamon sticks. For the wreath base we've got some English moss. And then for the foliage we've got blue pine spruce, pittosporum, eucalyptus, and I've chosen some pistache for some texture. And then in terms of berries, for the cool neutral version I've got some berried ivy, whereas for the traditional citrus we'll have some nice plump juicy red berries. Of course, one thing you will need is a pair of scissors. So to begin, we need to attach your real wire to the copper wreath ring, and I would take the end and very basically just wrap it around each other. Give it a little twist. And then with the end, just wrap that, coil it, so it's nice and smooth. That way we've got attached. Now I like to have it so that you're pulling the wire towards you. Okay, so to begin, we're just going to create a zigzag of wire all the way around. So you go in and out, into the circle and under, over and under. And you're just going to do this all the way around. Once you've covered it all, like so, keep the wreath, keep the wire attached. And then we're going to transfer the sphagnum moss onto the wire. So first you want to tease it, just to loosen it up, and this will make it go a lot further. Moss can be packed quite dense. Okay, once you've teased it, you want to form a sausage shape, nice and loose, not really hard, just nice and loose. And then you want to, where your wire is, you want to transfer one so that one end is in line with the wire. And with your wire, wrap it over and under, give it a little tug, over and under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, and then we start the process again. So you just want, again, to make a nice little sausage. Slightly overlap, and then over. In terms of thickness, that's as thick as I'm going, so a couple of centimetres. You can discard any bits like that. Okay, and then you have it. So you keep your wreath attached, and that's your wreath base. Okay, so now we're going to add our spruce. What I would do initially is have a test, and what you want to do is go in one direction, but if you lay it out first, then you get an idea for how thick. So you just want the pointy end at the top, the base end, and just work your way back so that we're covering these stems each time. And you want to make sure it's going out and in all the way. I would also make sure that you're using some small and some large. Where you get a piece like this, where it's a Y shape, use a piece with a point and layer them. This just enables me to use the whole stem of the branch. Again, so we've got a Y and a pointy bit. And with this section, we're going to place that under there. So that enables you, we've gone all the way around in one direction, and that gives you an idea of the fullness. So we're going to take it all off and then we'll wire it. One thing we need to do at this point is to attach our jute string. So this will enable us to hang it. So we're just going to fold it in half, tie a knot at this end, and then where you want your top to be, just loop it through, and that's how you'll hang. So this means that this is always going to be your top. So to begin wiring, we want to, where your real wire meets your base, you just want to go over and under. Might need to lift up some of the branches. Okay, so it should start to look like something like this. And to tie it off, you want your string out of the way, and with the end of your wire, take your scissors and cut maybe 15 centimeters. So we'll get rid of that. So with the end of the wire, you want to, like a needle and thread, underneath and through. You just wrap it round, sew it like a needle and thread. Just a couple of times. And then when there's just a tiny bit left over, you're just going to fold it and poke it back into the back of the wreath ring. And that just means there's no sharp objects. Okay, so now we're ready to add some foliage, but just be aware where the top of your wreath is, where the string is. I'm going to start with some pistache, and you may need to cut this down into smaller sections. We only want a small branch with just a few leaves on it, and we're going to use a lot of them distributed evenly around the wreath. So when you're cutting, make sure you've got some of the woody stem at the base, as this will help be able to secure it in place, because we're going to stick the stem into the moss. You're looking for pieces around about this size. And then a few just slightly bigger. Remember that all your foliage goes in the same direction. So to start planting your pistache in place, or the equivalent foliage, you want to make sure that your pistache is also following the same direction as the spruce. And then firmly holding the base of the woody stem, try and move past the spruce layer and stick the woody stem into the moss layer. And it should fit quite firm because this is quite a firm piece of foliage. Start to distribute the pistache evenly around the wreath, and you're just going to do this by eye where you can plug some gaps or you think that they need some texture. And don't forget to place it in and on the outside and on the inside just to give it that fullness. Okay, so now we've done the first layer, you should start to see it getting fuller and thicker and more textural, just like this. If you do still have some gaps, don't despair. We've got plenty more foliage to plug those gaps with. Moving on to the next form of foliage, I'm working with a variety of Pittosporum here, and you can also use, if you're picking stuff from the garden, you can also use foliage that is variegated, i.e. it has a couple of colours running through it. I like to use a contrasting colour just to give the wreath a little bit more depth. Some foliage like Pittosporum is a little bit more delicate and less stiff than say something like pistache, is not as woody. So you can begin to place this round the wreath, but if it doesn't go all the way through to the moss ring, don't worry, because we're going to use a pinning method which I'll show you in just a second. Now, because of the variation in colour, I don't want to cluster these elements too close together, so I'm going to try and make them equidistant. So to do this, I use the triangle method. So I just imagine there's a triangle on my wreath and I place them at the points of that triangle to begin with. I then do exactly the same thing with another 3 pieces, basically in the middle of where the original 3 pieces were placed. As I mentioned, these pieces may not feel quite so secure, so we may need to use a floristry wire to pin it in place. To do this, we want to make a hook, so bend the wire half or a third way along and make a U shape with the wire. To pin any foliage in place, we basically want the 2 sides of the wire to run either side of the stem and through into the moss. Sometimes it can take several tries for it to go through because there may be a stem or some spruce in the way, but please persevere. And a little tip is to hold the wire at the base. You'll have more control and it will be less likely to bend in on itself. Push the 2 ends of the wire all the way through to the back of the moss, so pull them through and make sure that they're both showing out the back. Then all you simply want to do is fold both ends in on themselves and poke each end into the back of the wreath ring, again so that there's no sharp pins that are then likely to scratch your door. Use this method to pin any of the looser bits in place. Next, we'll move on to our third and final piece of foliage. I always include some form of eucalyptus in the kit. I just really like, again, it's that contrast of colour, and eucalyptus really does remind me of Christmas. Again, we're going to cut it down into smaller pieces, and you want to cut, if you're cutting one piece into two pieces, you basically want to use the scissors to cut just above where the leaf comes off of the stem. That way you'll create two pieces. Just as we've done before, start positioning your eucalyptus around the wreath. And again, I'm using the triangle method again, just so that that distribution of colour isn't too bulky on one side. Also, just a reminder to make sure that the eucalyptus is travelling in the same direction as the rest of the foliage. Once again, depending on how stiff and sturdy these stems are, you may need to use the pinning method just to secure these pieces in place. So at this point, you should have something that looks quite full, quite textural, with a bit of contrast. And now we come to add the berries. Again, we're going to use the triangle method just so that they're distributed evenly. And again, we're going to pin them in place, as these berries generally don't come with a stiff stem. So if you're working on the traditional citrus kit, you will have some red berries, whereas if you're working on the cool neutral kit like this, you will likely have something green or even white, or possibly dark like this berried ivy. So now we come to the part where we add our dried embellishments. So we've got some cones, some cinnamon sticks, and some dried fruit. And usually at this point, it's a good idea, if you're having a bow, it's a good idea to decide at this point where you're going to place it. So I'm just going to mock up a bow. I will show you how to do this later, but I'm just going to mock up a bow so that you can see the positions that generally where people place it. So if you think of your wreath as a clock, most people will put their bow at 12 o'clock or possibly 6 o'clock, and sometimes 7, 8, 9 o'clock. I think for this one, I'm going to put mine at 6 o'clock at the bottom. So again, start with your wreath facing the right way up, so the string's at the top. And you can do this in any order, but I like to start with the cones. And using exactly the same method as we did with the floristry wires, we're going to position the cones in a triangular formation. And you want to put them in at a slight angle because it looks slightly unnatural when they're just standing upright. So just as before, my tip is to hold the wire at the base of the wire and poke it through all the way through so it comes out the back of the moss ring. Again, you might hit some stems that might get in the way, just keep persisting and you'll get there. And exactly as we've done before, fold the end round on itself and poke it back into the moss. If you do happen to get a cone with a particularly short wire and it doesn't want to fold back, just bend it back, almost like at a right angle, but make sure the sharp end of the wire is in the moss. Next, I'm going to put the dried fruits in exactly the same way. You want to be aware that in between the cones you're going to have two objects going in. So you've got the dried fruit and the cinnamon stick, and I like to just distribute this evenly. You can cluster them so you have a cone, a dried fruit and a cinnamon stick all in 3 clusters essentially across the wreath. It's totally up to you, but on this one I'm going to distribute them evenly. So for me here, I've set myself a rule that the dried fruit sits directly to the left of the cone. So now all that's left to do is put the last of the embellishments in, which is the cinnamon sticks, and I'm putting them where I've left the gap for it. The last thing to do is add a ribbon or bow if you are having one. And what you want to do is find that in the length of your ribbon you want to find the midpoint. Then quite simply all you need to do is take one end of the ribbon and fold it over to create one side of the bow, which will be a loop. Then you repeat the process with the other side, so you've kind of got an X, but it also starts to form a bow shape. All we do then is scrunch the middle, and you can start to see that it actually looks like a bow. Then just take one of the floristry wires and do exactly the same as before, create a U, but this time I would make the U point at a third of the length of the wire. You then want the crook of the wire to be placed in the midsection where you've made the scrunch point, and then very carefully just fold the wire in on itself and twist it at the back so you're securing the wire in place. Now to hide the wire, all you need to do is take one of the ends and fold it over. This hessian is quite stiff, so if you fold it over it should stay in place, and you can manipulate the wire quite easily. Make sure you know where you're going to position it by looking at where the string is, which will denote where the top is. Then the absolute last thing to do is to fix the bow in position using exactly the same method with the wire. So the wire goes through to the back of the moss, and then you fold it back on in itself and making sure there's no sharp ends poking out. And there we have it. Here's one I made earlier. Thank you so much for joining me. Merry Christmas!